What if the greatest lie ever sold to the modern world is the idea that your vote actually matters?
Wow, that is quite the hook.
Right. And I'm not talking about rigged elections or, corrupt politicians here. I mean, what if mathematically, fundamentally, adding your voice to the crowd doesn't build a better society, but actively destroys genius?
Yeah, that completely upends the foundation of the modern Western worldview. I mean, we're all raised on this belief that the wisdom of the crowd will always eventually outweigh the flaws of the individual.
Exact.
That collective decision-making is basically the pinnacle of human achievement.
Well, welcome to the deep dive. Today, you and the two of us are going to unpack a piece of writing that takes a total sledgehammer to that exact foundational belief.
A massive sledgehammer.
We're looking at a 2011 essay by an author named Su Feng, and the title, well, it really pulls no punches. It's called Democracy is the Pursuit of Mediocrity.
Yeah, he does not hold back.
Not at all. And our mission today is to deconstruct this text. It aggressively challenges everything we are taught to value about governance, consensus, and shared power.
Right, because it doesn't just critique democracy. It attempts to totally dismantle the very philosophical, historical, and structural logic behind it.
Right.
He basically builds a case for absolute autocracy as the only natural order of things.
Now, before we dive into the deep end of this text, I need to make something crystal clear to you, our listener. This source material contains some very strong, highly controversial political and ideological viewpoints.
Very strong.
And I want to state unequivocally that neither of us here are validating, endorsing, or taking sides on these viewpoints. Our mission today is strictly analytical.
Yeah, we are acting as impartial guides here to help you understand these concepts exactly as the author presented them.
Right, we aren't here to tell you what to think or, to judge the ethics of the argument. We're simply exploring how this specific author thinks and tracing the architecture of his logic.
Exactly. We're looking at the blueprints of his argument, piece by piece, just to understand how he arrives at his rather extreme conclusions.
Yeah.
And to understand Zhu Feng's worldview, we really have to start at the bedrock of his thesis, which is a direct, head-on attack against the concept of collective wisdom.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because he starts this attack by taking aim at a famous Chinese proverb, doesn't he?
He does, yeah. He begins with a proverb that essentially says that 3 humble cobblers, if they put their heads together, can outsmart Zhuge Liang.
Right. And for our listener, we should probably ELI5 Zhuge Liang for a second.
Good idea. Think of him as the ancient Chinese equivalent of a tactical hybrid between Julius Caesar and Albert Einstein.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, he is revered as an absolute master strategist, just a historical genius of unparalleled vision.
So the traditional proverb is basically the ultimate champion of collective wisdom. The idea that everyday working-class people, united, can equal the brain power of an elite genius.
Exactly. But Zhu Feng completely rejects that premise.
He scales it up drastically to prove his point, right?
Yeah, he argues that not only could 3 cobblers never exceed Zhu Juliang, but even 3,000 or 30,000 cobblers put together could not outwit him.
But hold on, doesn't modern crowdsourcing completely challenge that? Like, if you think about the way we operate today, the idea that millions of people contributing a tiny bit of knowledge can create something massive and highly functional seems, well, pretty well established.
Right, but what's fascinating here is that assumes you're just aggregating data.
Mm.
So Wei Feng is talking about high-stakes strategic execution.
I see.
He's framing consensus not as a moral strength, but as a mathematical dilution of genius. To him, adding more average minds to a problem doesn't create a superbrain. It just creates a thicker layer of bureaucracy that traps the visionary.
Right, because if you have a crisis that requires decisive, brilliant action, 30,000 cobblers aren't going to suddenly formulate a masterstroke.
No, they're going to argue, they're going to form committees, compromise, and ultimately settle on a thoroughly mediocre plan that, doesn't offend anyone, but also doesn't actually solve the problem.
It's like the ultimate design by committee problem.
Yes, exactly.
Imagine taking a brilliant visionary movie script written by a master filmmaker and then handing it over to 30,000 studio executives, telling them they all have to vote on the rewrites before it gets made.
Oh, that would be a nightmare.
You wouldn't get a masterpiece. You would get absolute, unwatchable nonsense because the original vision has to be watered down to appease the crowd.
That is a perfect analogy. And that is his core thesis established right in the opening. In critical moments, one visionary strategy will always, without exception, outperform the collective decisions of the mediocre.
Okay, but it's easy to say committees suck in a philosophical vacuum using a proverb about ancient strategists and cobblers. Here's where it gets really interesting. Does he actually have tangible, earthly evidence where a Democratic vote actively destroyed a movement?
He does, yeah. And this is where he moves from theory to historical proof. He uses the early 20th century timeline of Mao Zedong, specifically a series of political demotions, as his ultimate case study for why Democratic committees are physically destructive.
Walk us through this, because he doesn't just mention Mao in passing. He builds a very specific narrative about momentum and paralysis, right?
He really does. He traces a highly specific period where Mao was repeatedly pushed aside by party committees.
Okay.
So imagine Mao sitting in the room in June 1929 in Western Fujian at the 7th National Congress of the Fourth Red Army.
Setting the scene.
Right. He has this radical, singular vision for the movement. But he is surrounded by a committee that favors a different, perhaps more cautious or collectively agreeable approach.
So what happens?
Through a democratic process, Mao is forced out of his leadership position as the frontline committee secretary.
And the author frames this not as a functioning system checking an individual's power, but as the mediocre crowd punishing the genius.
Precisely. And he outlines how it just keeps happening. In November 1931, at the Southern Jiangxi meeting, Mao is elbowed out of the Central Committee.
Oh.
Then by October 1932, at the Ningdu meeting, the committee pushes him aside again, stripping his post as political commissar.
It's just a relentless string of committee demotions.
Yes.
Yeah.
And finally, by January 1934, during the Second Congress of the Soviet area, Mao was made a mere figurehead, completely removed from real power by the collective consensus.
So here is where the narrative gets incredibly tense, because Xu Feng is taking these committee votes and drawing a massive causal line to a catastrophic historical fallout.
He is. He argues that the direct result of these democratic demotions was that the red bases began to rapidly shrink. The revolution hit a low tide.
Right.
And most crucially, it led to the failure of the fifth counter-campaign against encirclement.
Let's give some context to that for our listener. The Fifth Encirclement meant the Red Army was literally surrounded by massive enemy forces. It was a total do-or-die crisis. And the author is arguing that because a committee was in charge, arguing and debating about what to do instead of following a singular visionary strategy, they basically paralyzed themselves.
Yes, and that paralysis, caused by democratic debate, ultimately forced the Red Army into the 25,000-li Long March.
Unbelievable.
According to Yufeng, the central base that Mao had personally built was destroyed almost overnight.
Wait, so the author is taking the Long March, which is so often framed historically as this epic, heroic survival story, this ultimate triumph of endurance against all odds, and he's categorizing it strictly as a tragic, disastrous consequence of stripping power away from a single visionary.
You've hit on the exact mechanism of his argument. He is completely reinterpreting the legacy of that event.
That is wild.
By using exact dates, exact locations, and specific committee meetings, he builds an argument that committee-driven compromises don't just fail in theory. They literally destroy physical, hard-won foundations.
So to him, it wasn't heroic at all.
No. To Xu Feng, the Long March wasn't a heroic choice. It was a desperate, deadly retreat, a 6,000-mile trek where tens of thousands died, caused entirely by the incompetence of democratic decision-making.
If you're listening to this right now, you are probably thinking, this sounds incredibly cynical, maybe even dictatorial.
Oh, absolutely.
And you're right to feel that friction, because it is a staggering way to view human organization. He's looking at a historical tragedy and saying, look at this disaster, this was caused by people taking a vote.
Exactly.
So if human history proves to the author that committees fail so spectacularly, where does he look for a successful model? Like, what does he think we should actually be doing?
Well, he scales up far beyond human history. He looks to the structure of the universe itself.
The universe, okay.
According to Xu Feng, the universe operates flawlessly because it is run as a unilateral dictatorship by what he calls the greatest creator.
The ultimate cosmic autocracy.
Yes. He argues that the universe only functions and life only survives because everything, planets, stars, natural laws, strictly follows the singular will of this creator.
So he takes it to a literal universal scale.
He does. And he uses a very striking, almost comical image to illustrate how absurd he finds the alternative. He says, imagine if a cat or a dog wasn't convinced by this autocratic setup and started crying out, demanding democratic elections for the throne of the universe.
A golden retriever standing at a cosmic ballot box demanding a turn to run reality.
Exactly. And Suefeng argues that if that happened, if the universe were actually subject to democratic turns, debates, and shared rule, reality itself would collapse. All would disappear into chaos.
Wow.
He brings in a quote from Napoleon to support this need for singular command, saying, "Nothing is more difficult and therefore more precious than to be able to decide."
The paralysis of choice. When you have a committee, no one actually has to decide. Everyone just hedges their bets.
Which is why he connects this to a broader philosophical maxim. He quotes, "The sage embraces the one and becomes the model of the world."
Embraces the one.
Right. And Zhuifeng maps this concept of the one onto every single level of human existence. The greatest creator is the one in the universe. A state leader must be the one in government. A company boss must be the one in a business. And crucially, a conductor is the one in an orchestra.
Okay, to use the author's orchestra example, it makes perfect sense within his framework. It's like trying to have the violinist, the percussionist, and the brass section stop and vote on the tempo in the middle of a Beethoven symphony.
Exactly, you wouldn't get music.
You would get total, unlistenable chaos.
Oh.
Someone has to hold the baton and dictate the pace, or the entire performance falls apart.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Shuofeng is appealing to natural and cosmic law to justify strict autocracy in everyday human organizations. He even applies this directly to his own organization, a community called Lifechanyuan. He states flatly that if his role as guide were subjected to a democratic election and he was voted out, Lifechanyuan would inevitably dissolve, and the dreams of all its members would be ruined.
He really puts himself right in the center of that philosophy.
He sees himself as the necessary one for his specific sphere. Whoever creates a business, he argues, is the boss, and all decisions, big or small, are theirs alone to make.
He leaves zero room for ambiguity there. So what does this all mean? If singular leadership is the natural, perfect order of the universe, and the only way to avoid societal collapse, it begs a pretty massive question.
What's that?
What is the psychological profile of the people who actually want democracy? If it's so obviously flawed to him, who are these people fighting for a vote?
Yeah. This is where the text gets highly psychological. Shuofeng outlines 8 specific types of people who desire democracy, and it reads as a searing indictment of shared governance.
I can imagine.
But he isn't just throwing insults. He is trying to expose the mechanics of why people hide in crowds.
Break that down for us. What is the underlying psychology he sees here?
He lists types like irresponsible people, people with mediocre minds, power scramblers, the selfish, and profiteers. But the most revealing categories are people who do things stealthily and responsibility shifters.
Wait, people who do things stealthily, why does he link stealth to democracy?
Because in a committee, you can hide your individual failures behind the group's vote.
Oh, wow.
The author's core psychological thesis, and this is really the aha moment of the essay, is that democracy isn't actually a system of governance. It is a hiding place for the inadequate.
That is brutal.
Right. If a project fails under a democracy, the responsibility shifters can simply shrug and say, well, the committee voted for it. It wasn't just my idea. It's the perfect camouflage for incompetence.
That is a memorable, albeit brutal, way to look at a boardroom.
Yeah.
He's arguing that shared responsibility is just a myth people use to avoid the terrifying burden of personal accountability.
Exactly.
So how does his ideal community function day to day without turning into a bureaucratic nightmare?
It relies on an operational philosophy he describes as 8 immortals crossing the sea, each showing their special prowess.
What does that mean in practice?
What it means is that every single undertaking, no matter how small, has exactly one responsible person. Everyone else involved must fully cooperate and strictly follow that person's requirements.
So no pushback at all.
0 arguments, 0 debates, 0 consensus.
He sees consensus as a bug in the system, not a feature.
Absolutely. He argues that the moment you have 2 or more people jointly controlling anything, you have created a low-efficiency process that drains resources and inevitably ends in mutual finger-pointing.
Yeah, the classic corporate blame game.
Right. And he uses another powerful analogy here to illustrate the danger of collective weakness. He says no matter how democratic a flock of sheep is, it can never resist a wolf.
It makes sense within the logic he's built. If you think the crowd is mediocre and paralyzed by indecision, then crowdsourcing a defense against a wolf is just a very democratic, highly documented way to get eaten.
Exactly. To Yuefeng, democracy is a weakness of the prey. The wolf doesn't form a committee before it strikes, it just acts.
But doesn't this entire system require a terrifying amount of trust from the people doing the following?
Oh, for sure.
Like, if you have a workplace or a society operating under the eight immortals rule, with zero debates and zero pushback allowed, what happens if the one singular person in charge is just spectacularly, catastrophically wrong? There are absolutely no guardrails in this model.
That is the crux of his philosophy. He values singular accountability above all else.
No matter the cost.
Right. In his view, it is infinitely better to have one person fail clearly, rapidly, and be held entirely accountable than to have a committee fail slowly, vaguely, and point fingers at each other for years. Efficiency and clarity of command trump the safety net of consensus.
Which brings us to the end of his essay, and honestly, this is where the text takes a turn that I did not see coming.
Quite the twist.
Yeah. After spending all this time building an ironclad, unapologetic argument that democracy is a hiding place for the mediocre, that we must blindly trust the one, and that autocracy is the fundamental law of the cosmos, he poses a hypothetical question to himself.
This raises an important question, doesn't it? It highlights a stark vulnerability in everything we've just discussed.
Yeah.
At the very end of the text, he asks, what should we do when a leader is self-willed, domineers their power, and exercises tyranny?
The ultimate fatal flaw in the dictatorship model, the tyrant. The wolf who is supposed to be protecting the sheep suddenly turns around and starts eating them.
Exactly.
And after all this absolute certainty, all this cosmic philosophy and historical proof about Mao and the universe, what is his stunning, abrupt conclusion to the essay?
He writes simply, I do not know. What do you think?
I do not know. What do you think? It's an incredible mic drop.
It really is.
It's like meticulously designing an airplane that flies at supersonic speeds, boasting about how it outpaces every other vehicle ever made, but casually admitting right before takeoff that you never bothered to invent a parachute.
That's a great way to put it. It forces the reader to confront the extreme limits of his philosophy.
Yeah, he just leaves it hanging.
He diagnoses the friction of democracy perfectly. The slowness, the agonizing compromises, the lack of accountability, the way mediocrity can stifle genius.
Right.
But he leaves the fatal flaw of autocracy completely, totally unsolved. The system works perfectly, right up until the moment the one becomes a monster. And at that exact moment, the author simply throws his hands up and asks the reader for help.
Wow. Well, it has been quite the intellectual journey unpacking this text with you today. We've gone from the ancient proverb of the cobblers to the catastrophic retreat of the Long March, up to the greatest creator ruling the cosmos, and finally ended on a massive cliffhanger about unchecked tyranny.
That covers a lot of ground.
It really does. Thank you, our listener, for taking the time to explore such a dense, unapologetically provocative piece of writing with us. We really hope this deep dive gave you a new lens through which to view how we organize ourselves, whether that's in a government, a startup, or, just your next group project.
Absolutely.
And we want to leave you with a final lingering thought. Something for you to mull over that builds on Schweffing's essay, but pushes it a bit further into our everyday reality. If collective decision-making, as he argues, risks a slow, frustrating stagnation into mediocrity, but absolute authority risks a rapid, uncontrollable descent into unchecked tyranny without a single fail-safe, is the ultimate challenge of human organization not about finding the perfect system? Perhaps perfection is impossible. Perhaps the real task is simply choosing which type of failure we are more willing to endure. When you look at the systems in your own life, which failure scares you less?